One of the typical objections atheists give against God's existence is that the God hypothesis is not as simple as the naturalist hypothesis. The atheist may say theists believe in one extra thing, so naturalism is simpler. But is this how we should be comparing theism and naturalism's simplicity in relation to each other? How are we supposed to judge the simplicity of two competing hypotheses? Consider this. Suppose we are judging the relative simplicity of two model universes, our own universe and a possible alternative universe, AU. When we go to assess the simplicity of the universes, how should we do it? One method would be to count up all the things each universe contains, Minecraft worlds, dogs, planets, and see how many there are. We then compare the two numbers and judge that the universe that contains less things is simpler. But if this was the right way to compare the relative simplicity of two hypotheses, it would exaggerate the complexity of our current model of the universe. Consider the standard model of particle physics, from here referred to as SM. SM posits 16 fundamental particles that fit into 3 categories, and in 2 categories there is an obvious symmetry. Now, knowing SM allows you to understand, given initial conditions of the relevant sort of universe, what kind of universe you will end up with and why it has the features it has. You don't need to know anything more than what SM can tell you to understand how the universe works. Here's the issue. If simplicity was assessed on the grounds of counting up the total number of things in a model, then SM would not be as simple as AU if AU removed the 16 fundamental particles to say what they explained were brute facts. In following that conception of simplicity, AU would then be simpler. But very clearly, this is not how philosophers, scientists, and philosophers of science assess simplicity. Instead, we just compare the fundamental theories, not the theories' end states of affairs. In other words, we only compare the theories, not what the theories are trying to explain. The same applies when comparing theism and naturalism. To say otherwise is just arbitrary. Theism, depending on the model, posits a necessary being whose necessity is explained via metaphysical necessity. Bare theism posits a person with 2 properties, knowledge and power, held in the simplest possible way, zero limitation. It's worth noting whether that one person entails the existence of a trinity is a separate matter, but not one that changes the simplicity of the hypothesis. Why is zero limitation simpler? It is simpler in just the same way that the hypothesis that has some particle has zero mass, or infinite velocity, is simpler than the hypothesis that it has a mass of 0.34127 of some unit or a velocity of 301,000 kilometers per second. A finite limitation cries out for an explanation of why there is just that particular limit, in a way that limitlessness does not. And scientific practice shows this preference for infinite values over large finite values of a property. Given 2 hypotheses, it is preferred to postulate that light had an infinite velocity rather than a particularly large finite velocity, for example 301,000 kilometers per second, until data was found that was very improbable on the former hypotheses. But note that the preference for the infinite over the large finite only applies to degrees of properties and not numbers of independent entities, which is exactly what theism does. So under theism, the explanation of every contingent truth is a function of the value of the corresponding states of affairs. In other words, God would choose to bring about a valuable world. So theism, like the standard model, postulates as the base of its system a simple structure. It posits one fundamental entity of a familiar kind, a person, and a principle of creativity in terms of value, to explain the existence of all contingent reality. So in terms of explanatory axioms, theism turns out to be a very simple hypothesis indeed. Theists posit one entity of a familiar kind that lacks arbitrary limits. Naturalism, on the other hand, lacks this kind of explanatory simplicity and systematicity. For instance, on naturalism, there will be quite a number of brute facts. The existence of a contingent being, the existence of a number of laws, the many particular parameters of those laws. Counting up the number of brute facts in naturalism will be difficult, and it depends on what model the naturalist uses, but it seems that it postulates more than one brute existent. And even if it did postulate only one brute existent, then it would be at most equally simple. There are more than 10 fundamental particles, and it is hard to see how each particle's existence isn't a brute fact on naturalism. Of course, there are other methods of assessing simplicity, and it could be that there is some plausible one that would favor naturalism over theism, but I'm not aware of one, however. And so the usual theists believe one extra thing response is inadequate. Given everything, theism is simpler than naturalism.